Okay, how's the sound there? Can you hear me? Okay, thanks for coming out. Okay, so as Janet said, I'll be talking about the Kilauea's activity over the past year, but also talking, giving a background on its two eruptions. And I am talking about two eruptions. We have an eruption ongoing at, two spots. We have an eruption on the East Rift Zone that a year ago sent lava into Pu'u O'o. This is the Pu'u O'o event, and we have an eruption at the summit that has a continuously circulating lava lake in Halemaumau crater. So I'll be talking about each. And I'll be giving some background, like this map of the island, which is probably repetition for most of you, but bear with me. And as most of you know, the Big Island, or the island of Hawaii, consists of 5 volcanoes, 3 of which have been active in historic times, the last couple hundred years. So Hualai last erupted in 1801, Mauna Loa, which covers half the island, last erupted in 1984, and Kilauea here on the southeast portion of the island has 2 ongoing eruptions. And also offshore we have Loihi. So Kilauea has, let's zoom in on Kilauea now. This is the focus of the talk. And so at the summit, we have the summit caldera. It's a couple miles wide. And then we have the southwest rift zone and the east rift zone. And these rift zones are common to Hawaiian volcanoes, and they're just zones of structural weakness that magma preferentially moves along, and often, and so eruptions on Kilauea almost always occur either at the summit or along a rift zone. So the East Rift Zone eruption, the current eruption on the East Rift Zone, is at Pu'u O'o, which is a cinder cone about here. And at the summit, we have a lava lake here in Halemaumau crater. So the separation here is I think about 12 miles. And it's kind of good when you're thinking about these two eruptions. It's good to appreciate how interconnected they are, and here's a cartoon that kind of helps with that. This is obviously a really basic cartoon. It's not to scale, but we have magma rising up from the mantle, and it rises up presumably along a narrow conduit, and it rises into a summit magma reservoir complex, like a summit chamber. And it's not this simple. I just drew a simple circle here. Obviously, it's a lot more complex. We know there's actually probably 2 distinct bodies that form that summit reservoir complex. But in any case, that summit chamber or chamber system feeds magma to the summit lava lake here in Halemaumau, and also presumably along a narrow conduit, it feeds magma out along the East Rift Zone to erupt at Pu'u O'o. So we'll often see, because, these 2 eruptions, so they're jointly fed by the same magma chamber complex. So we often see correlations in their activity. So let's first look at the East Rift Zone eruption. So this is the eruption at Pu'u O'o. So this eruption began on January 3rd, 1983. It just had its 33rd birthday. So this is really remarkable. The average eruption duration worldwide is something like 7 weeks. So compare that to 33 years. It's really a remarkable duration. So let's go back to the beginning. And again, many of you probably know the history of the Pu'u O'o eruption. It began in 1983. And for those first 3 years, the eruption mostly consisted of these high episodic fountains. You often see these pictures of fountains in the brochures. These were high fountains, several hundred yards high, and the fallout, so that spatter and cinder falling out, basically created this cone, which we now call Pu'u O'o. And those fountains would last for about a day, and then there'd be a pause of several weeks or a month. And when those fountains were active, they would feed these fast-moving A'a flows. And you can see these kind of distinct fingers. These are distinct flows that were fed by these fountains. Now, these A'a flows didn't reach the ocean because once the fountain died out after a day or so, the flow would basically be cut off, so the flow would stall. So there were several dozen of these episodes through the first 3 years. And like I said, those fountains fed O'o flows. So most of you appreciate what O'o flows are like. It's this rubbly, often channelized and kind of faster focused flow. Oh, that's us getting measurements at the flow front. This is obviously sped up by a large factor. I can't run that fast, so. So this is actually a flow in 2008 going down one of the roads in Royal Garden Subdivision, which is now completely buried. But you get a sense of the conveyor belt-like action. So the interior of the flow is very fluid, but the exterior is this rubbly consistency. So in 1986, the eruption changed in a major way. We had the vent shift downslope a couple miles to a spot called Kupaianaha. And so the pink here is the previous 1983 to 86, and the red here is the 86 to 92 activity. And the activity shifted to Kupaianaha here, this new vent, a couple miles downrift of Pu'u O'o. And with the shift in the vent, the eruption style changed in a major way. So previously, we saw those impressive episodic fountains that fed these kind of short-lived O'o flows. But beginning in 86 with Kupaianaha, we had a shift to Pahoehoe flow field behavior. And so these were tube-fed Pahoehoe flows. So Pahoehoe, I'll show you in the next slide what that's like. Many of you already know that, how it behaves. But these flows were tube-fed. So the lava, basically the flow field developed the lava tube system. And the lava tube system is really good at insulating the lava. So it allows the lava to stay hot and travel long distances. And that's basically what was set up with Kupaianaha over these years. These lava tubes transported lava all the way to the ocean. And well, what I didn't mention in the last slide, when those earlier flows entered Royal Garden Subdivision, several dozen structures were destroyed. But this phase, this 86 to 92, the Kupaianaha phase, was the most destructive phase of the eruption so far. That's because, in large part, because a portion of the lava flow field extended east and basically buried the town of Kalapana. So what is Pahoehoe behavior? Many of you have probably walked out on the flow field and walked over Pahoehoe. But this is what it looks like. It's this kind of lobate, often ropey texture, but it's often slow and it moves in this kind of incremental fashion. And a big part of Pahoehoe behavior is called inflation. So the flow develops a thin crust, but there's still fluid being transported beneath the crust, and it kind of blows it up like a balloon. This is obviously sped up by quite a bit. So you can think of, when you think of Pahoehoe and O'o, it's kind of like the tortoise and the hare fable. O'o is kind of quicker moving, but in the case of the early phase of Pu'u O'o, it ended quicker. Pahoehoe might be slower moving in many cases, but in this case it was more sustained, so it was able to travel longer distances. So in 1992, we had a shift. We had Kupaianaha vent shut down, and we had the vent shift upslope back to Pu'u O'o. But even though there was that shift in the vent location back to Pu'u O'o, back where it previously was, the eruption style stayed the same, which was this tube-fed Pahoehoe behavior. And we had vents and lava tubes feeding lava on the west side of the flow field here. So there was a lot of expansion. This is obviously a long period, 15 years of sustained Pahoehoe behavior. So it covered a large area and obviously created a lot of flow field expansion out here towards the west. And you can see this is the park boundary. A lot of that activity was in the park. So this was a great time for flow, to access the active flows. Many of you probably parked here and walked out and visited the active flows. That was possible when the flows were active in the park. Now, the other interesting thing about this phase is that, again, the lava tubes allowed the lava to be transported efficiently and easily reach the ocean, and it created these ocean entries. And these were, another spectacular aspect of the eruption, also arguably the most dangerous part of the flow field, with bench collapses and explosions. Now, during this phase, only 6 structures were destroyed. This is in Royal Garden Subdivision, because this area is mostly undeveloped mostly undeveloped national park land. So in 2007, mid-2007, actually just a few months before I arrived at HVO, we had a number of changes, and we actually had the vent shift downslope. Again, a couple kilometers, almost to Pu'u O'o, and it created, new activity. And we had still sustained tube-fed pahoehoe behavior, but the flow, in this case, went right down the middle of the flow field, actually covered most of the remains of Royal Garden Subdivision. That's the 23 structures here. But actually, this includes 3 structures that were destroyed in 2010, 2011 in Kalapana Garden Subdivision. You can see a little bit of the activity was heading towards the northeast, but that didn't last that long. Most of the activity was towards the southeast. So you can see that most of this flow field activity, the vents were up here. Most of the flow field activity was directed towards the south, towards the ocean. But we started to see a shift in this activity. There was a lot of really dynamic behavior in 2011. So we had basically a short-lived event here called the Kamoamoa eruptive event, just west of Pu'u O'o. This is when there were fountains that lasted for 4 or 5 days. Really impressive activity, but short-lived. Eventually, in late 2011, activity returned to Pu'u O'o with a new vent that sent lava towards the south, again creating another ocean entry. Only one structure was destroyed, the last structure in Royal Gardens. And the shift that we started to see during this period really started in mid-2013, with the start of the Kaha Lea flow. So we had vents that opened up on the north side of Pu'u O'o, and it started to send lava towards the northeast here. So, here's the rift zone, and you can think of it as a subtle ridge. So if you have a vent that opens on the north side of Pu'u O'o, this prominent cone, the lava is basically going to be confined towards the north. It's not able to wrap around towards the south because of this subtle ridge. And that's what happened. That's the kind of behavior that started in mid-2013 with the Kaha Lea flow. Now, this was a hazard concern because these flows were upslope of subdivisions like Ainaloa, Paradise Park, potentially Pahoa. And we know that they're upslope because we look at the topography. So these blue lines are what we call lines of steepest descent. So you can think of them just as hydraulic drainages. So if you drop a ball on a surface, this is the direction, this is the path it's going to roll. Or if you pour water onto the surface, this is the direction it's going to flow. Obviously, pahoehoe behavior is a lot more complex, but it generally flows downhill. So these blue lines are a pretty good indicator of where the lava will head. So we started to see this change, this lava directed towards the northeast beginning in mid-2013. But then we had another big change. One of the big changes was on June 27th, 2014. We had a kind of a brief period of pressure buildup in Pu'u O'o. And what that resulted in is basically lava broke out, ruptured on the north flank of the cone here, created several new vents. In that first day, there was actually that buildup of pressure was kind of relieved quickly, and so it sent out a fast-moving A'a flow, but this didn't last very long. What did persist, was pahoehoe activity, tube-fed, that kind of came in this direction, towards the northeast. So this is the first day. That vent, unfortunately, was on the north side of the cone. Again, like I said, there's this subtle ridge here, so that means that any lava that comes out of the vent is going to be directed towards the northeast, kind of like the Kaha Lea flow.